We are applying ideas from lean manufacturing to entrepreneurship to adopt a rapid experimentation approach. See, that's already too many characters, right?
Sorry, just say it again. It was good.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to need 2 tweets probably for this, but the first tweet would be about applying ideas from lean manufacturing to the process of entrepreneurship. Okay. And the second tweet would be in order to have a rapid experimentation approach.
Right. So in Ontario, we actually have a lot of experience with lean manufacturing. We have had and continue to have a pretty robust manufacturing industry, and a lot of organizations that are surviving now and thriving because they adopted that lean concept. So tell me, how does your lean fit with that Toyota way lean that traditional manufacturing employed?
Yeah, there are deep similarities, and I think that organizations and communities that have that deep experience in traditional lean have an advantage in adopting lean startup because it draws on so many of the concepts from lean. The way I would put it, I actually would borrow this from a phrase from a very senior Toyota executive who I had the privilege of meeting not too long ago, who was investigating the application of lean startup inside of Toyota themselves, which was a real full circle moment for me.
Bingo.
And he said, this is the missing half of a Toyota production system. That Toyota production system is very good at efficiently producing what the customer wants, if you know what the customer wants. And lean startup is, you think about this as an equally efficient and rigorous process for discovering what the customer wants in the first place. And so much of traditional business in the 20th century was governed by incremental improvements over products that had a long history, relatively stable markets by today's standards, and companies that could achieve dominance over those markets for the long haul. And what that meant was there were a lot of techniques that took for granted what the customer wanted. We know the customer wants superior performance, better quality, and lower price of a given product for a very specific use case, and we could keep tackling that problem year in, year out and achieve market leadership that way. But we live in a time now when stability is not really the watchword. And what we're discovering is that more and more of the time in business, not 100% of the time, but a larger part of the portfolio of work that we manage today is governed by uncertainty about what the customer wants in the first place. And we need to set up techniques for reliably and rigorously discovering them.
So last year, we'll just find out, do a quick survey here. How many of you, and just put up your hand if you, how many of you were here last year when we interviewed Steve Blank on this stage? Possibly about a half to a third. Okay, so that's great. So Steve Blank, we're just going to fill in the blanks for you. Steve Blank was a mentor, I guess,
and an investor in my company.
Of Eric's. He told us that there are no answers in the office. You've got to get out of the company. You've got to get out of the office. You've got to go see the customer, test all the time. So how did you run into Steve Blank? Tell us a little bit about your interaction with him and how you took his ideas a little bit further.
Sure. So in order to understand this history, you got to go all the way back to 2001 when I moved out to Silicon Valley. And the company that I was just telling you about that raised $40 million, a not insignificant number of those millions of dollars came from Steve. He was one of the major investors and a board member in this company. And he eventually left the board because he could not convince the company to abandon his traditional Silicon Valley approach. It was so entrenched at that time, it was considered quite crazy to do anything different. And a number of us who were kind of refugees from that company, we wound up starting a new company in 2004 after the company failed. And we had the audacity, to go back to Steve and say, listen, remember how we lost you all that money in that previous company? How would you feel like investing in the new company? Do I want to sign up to do it again?
God bless Silicon
at that time, yeah, it's the Silicon Valley way. That we would even conceive of that as a possibility, let alone that he would say yes, is a very Silicon Valley story. But the wrinkle in the story was he had just begun at that time teaching a class at the Berkeley Haas School of Business in what he called customer development, which was exactly what you said, this process of getting out of the building and testing assumptions with customers. If you think about it as the marketing, a new approach to marketing for startups. And he basically said, look, if you'll come audit this class, I'll invest in your companies. That was the deal. And that's really how this collaboration began. My co-founder and I would trek down to Berkeley from Palo Alto, and we would, listen to what Steve said, and he eventually joined our board, and we got a chance to put a lot of his ideas into practice at that company starting in 2004. But I'm an engineer by training, not a marketer. So at first this seemed like kind of an interesting but quaint, marketing approach. I wasn't too concerned with it. I remember asking Steve quite often, well, how do I apply this to engineering? That's my department. And, at the time he was like, well, I don't know, but, good luck. And we eventually kind of worked out that there were a set of kind of universal principles that could apply in many different functions, not just engineering, not just marketing, and eventually not just those, but supply chain and HR, legal, you name it, we've been there. And eventually that's what I wound up calling Lean Startup.
Right. So you and Steve are sort of, I guess, co-fathers of this, and possibly with some others as well. Have you diverged at all? Is there any daylight between your version of the Lean Startup and what Steve Blank would say?
I'm sure there is. I leave that kind of stuff to historians to judge. What's interesting to me actually is not so much how we've diverged in our philosophy, but in terms of the kinds of work that we do. So Steve has built an incredible program trying to transform, at first, how universities teach entrepreneurship. He's had a huge impact, especially at universities in the United States have adopted his curriculum for teaching entrepreneurship, and that curriculum then got imported out of research universities into the way the government funds basic science research and science commercialization. So while I've been doing all this work in the private sector, Steve has taken on this enormous challenge in the public sector and nonprofit sector to really change how people are introduced to entrepreneurship in the first place. It's been pretty cool to watch.
So tell us a little bit about how you spend your time, Eric. You're writing a couple more books, you're putting on conferences, you're investing, I guess, in a number of companies. Tell us about you.
Yeah, well, the pay it forward ethos in Silicon Valley is strong, so I do try to give back and invest in companies the way people invested in me when they really had no earthly reason to. I live a very strange existence right now. I have this very strange thing that happens to me. I spend my time kind of equally between very young, ambitious, hyper-growth companies. Imagine the two guys in a garage, but also I spend a lot of time now with pre-IPO venture-backed startups, the kind you read about in the newspaper. And I also spend my time with really old bureaucratic companies. So I spend time with very, very large manufacturing companies. I spend some time with some governments and even some of the older tech companies that are long past product market fit. And so you would think that the conversations I would have with those two kinds of companies would be really radically different. I would have almost two different set of prescriptions for the two. And the thing that nobody really believes is that I have almost the exact same conversation everywhere I go. And it took me a long time to understand why. And eventually it hit me as I was giving a talk at a very hot company that you all know. And I was getting questions from the audience that sounded exactly like the kind of questions I get from these older companies. And I eventually started asking them questions. I said, well, tell me about how's your company organized by departments? What does the org chart look like? And how do you fund projects? And how do you hold managers accountable? Who gets promoted and why? And it just hit me right in this moment. Even though this company is less than 5 years old, they have built it faithfully and with great rigor to that same 20th century corporate blueprint that these older companies were built to. And if you build to the same blueprint, you have the same foundation, you wind up with the same kinds of problems. And it's amazing to me how quickly those problems manifest if you build to that blueprint. And part of my work now has been trying to convince people that Lean Startup is not just about a technique you can use to get started. It's really about what is the management philosophy that you should use when you face conditions of extreme uncertainty, as we all do. And I think that is going to require that we adopt a whole new idea of what does the blueprint of a modern company look like. That's quite different than what was used in the 20th century.
We've got a real mix of people here. We have young entrepreneurs, startups, scale-ups. We've got people representing some very big organizations. Let's help them out a little bit. So, Eric, what would your first advice be for an organization that's been around for a while, was successful, needs a new model today because of for all the reasons we know? How would they get started on a leaner, more customer development approach today?
Yeah, I have a diagram in the book that I think is very important, and I call it the startup way. It's based on a diagram from the book The Toyota Way that I'm sure many of you know. And it just goes like this: accountability, process, culture, people, in that order. Accountability, process, culture, people. When most companies want to do transformation, lean transformation, any kind of transformation, they tend to go about it exactly backwards. They say, oh, I want to be more entrepreneurial, let's go buy a startup. Or let me go hire some fancy entrepreneurial people to replace the boring bureaucratic dullards that already work here. You know what I'm talking about? And then they think, all right, maybe they're very, very advanced. They'll take some lessons in culture building, and they'll put up posters that say, you know, whatever slogans are feeling good about everybody be creative and break the rules. And there's actually companies that will help you spray paint the Facebook-style slogans on your walls, just like Facebook. You know, move fast and break things, spray paint. If they're very, very advanced, maybe they think about process, but they rarely think about the systems that they themselves use as senior management to hold people accountable. And my claim is that if you want to do this transformation, you really got to go exactly backwards. You've got to start with, how are people in this company held accountable? And that starts with the recognition that different people in the organization, right now, in any size company, you have people doing different kinds of work, but with the same business card. You know, when I interview product managers in today's modern companies, I meet product managers who are working on version 117 of a product that we have been making for decades, and we are the clear market leader in, and they're trying to make it slightly more efficient or have better cost profile, improve its quality. And then I meet people who are working on version 1 of a product we have no idea if anybody's going to buy. Now, the accountability standards for those two jobs need to be different, and so the fact that those two people have the same business cards as a product manager is a significant problem. And here's the reason why. Modern management, you know, coming from Sloan and Drucker and even going all the way back to Henry Ford and Fred Taylor, has been all about eliminating variability through standardization. So we want to eliminate variance, which means predictability is what we prize. Everyone knows that a project that's ahead of budget, on time, on plan is a good one, right? Our quarterly profits we report to the markets are, you know, ahead of forecast, and we do well. If they're behind, you know, that's how we focus. And that whole system of accountability requires having an accurate forecast in the first place, because you got to say, well, where did the forecast come from? And in my world of Silicon Valley and startups, when first time in my career, someone told me that people make forecasts and they come true, I would almost fall out of my chair. I said, where do I meet these mythical people? Because in the startup world, we make forecasts all the time, but we don't believe them. I mean, you'd have to be crazy. I used to think you gave spreadsheets and forecasts to VCs as a kabuki ritual to prove to them that you could endure the pain of building a complicated Excel spreadsheet to show your toughness. I had no idea what it was for. The idea that they thought that I was predicting what would happen in the future, that seemed crazy to me. And yet, most companies in their main lines of business, pre-disruption, everything's quite predictable. So, the accuracy of those forecasts comes from having a long and stable operating history from which to extrapolate the forecast. So the number one recognition we need as senior leadership in any company that wants to transform into the modern age is some parts of your business are still governed by that stability, and traditional management methods will work. But you have to carve out part of your organization to say, wait a minute, this is the part of the organization where we don't have accurate forecasts. We really don't know what's going to happen in the future, and different methods, different standards of accountability.
Fantastic. That's really helpful. I saw a lot of people nodding. A few people are tweeting. Don't forget to use the hashtag OCE Discovery. We do have some people who are submitting questions online. There's a question related to some of the companies you've invested in, and someone would like to know, Eric, what is the most successful business that you've been able to help with your theories?
Interesting. You know, take this for what it's worth, but there's almost no correlation between the amount of time and energy I have invested in companies to help them and their ultimate economic returns to me. So I probably made the most money from the companies I spent the least time with, and vice versa. And you know, what's funny about that is, you know, when you're an advisor, you can only help entrepreneurs with what they want your help with. You don't control what they do. You don't manage. You're much more like a coach than you are like a manager. And what's interesting to me is some of the biggest lean startup successes have come from, not from companies that I work with directly, from people who left those companies and went on to start their own companies in the second and third generations. So there's like a whole crop of Silicon Valley companies today, that some of which I'm lucky enough to be an investor in, but some of which I'm not, but have had this legacy where they got to see it kind of botched and done wrong and messed up, and they learned a lot from that experience. They said, well, I'm never going to make those mistakes again. So, the other thing is that I'm very reluctant to name names. I know people always want to know, well, name the companies for me so we can judge how successful you are. And if you read most business books and talk to a lot of business authors, it's like every great company in history is like retroactively adopted as a lean startup. Just like Apple is a lean startup, and Southwest is a lean startup. But you pick your favorite company, they're a lean startup. So I don't like to do that. What I'd rather do, we put on a conference every year called the Lean Startup Conference. And we ask companies to speak in their own words, kind of give case studies of how they've applied the ideas. And we make all the videos of all of those talks and case studies available for free on YouTube. So if people really want to hear from famous people endorsing Lean Startup, there's a lot of people you can hear from in their own words rather than me kind of taking credit for their success.
Good enough. I did enjoy the Dropbox video on your site, so that's some of those are definitely worth looking at. What you were saying there sort of reminded me of another comment that you made recently where you mentioned that the academic community hasn't really studied your program, and you admit it's not really proven that the lean startup works. We don't really have that kind of data. We've got lots of happy entrepreneurs, we've got lots of anecdotal data, but we don't have anything scholarly. And you said so far you haven't been successful in convincing scholarship to actually embrace this concept and study it. Why do you suppose that is?
That's a very deep question. It has to do with the incentives and structures of academia, which to me is a black box. It's interesting. We've had more success convincing business schools to teach the lean startup as an operating methodology than we have had finding academics who will study the lean startup to find out if the prescriptions are any good. And of course, the question in the back of my mind is always like, hey, the people who are teaching this, I understand in business you have to kind of go with your gut and you take the best information available. If it seems intuitively right, you try it. But in academia, I always thought that you'd be held to a higher standard, and so far, it hasn't happened. I'll tell you that when people ask me this question, what convinces me that it's right? There's of course my personal experience with it, which is has really helped me a lot in my own career. But the evidence that I look really speaks to me in a different way than that is. In hundreds of cities around the world, there are lean startup meetups where entrepreneurs get together on a regular basis to talk about these ideas and push them forward. And the thing that I like about that, the people who come up on stage and talk about lean startup professionally, like me, we have all kinds of incentives to say how great lean startup is. I mean, that's practically my job. That's what I get paid to do, is go around telling about how great it is. And there's plenty of other entrepreneurs who have made lean startup part of their speaking profile and helps them get the word out about their company. And there's a lot of people who benefit from lean startup financially, commercially, indirectly. But the people who go to these meetups are not in that category. They don't get paid to speak about lean startup. They don't have a hope of getting famous. It's not like there's reality TV show cameras coming to the meetup to see what they're up to. These are people voluntarily spending their own time with no other benefit except that they hope that as they learn more about these ideas, they'll be able to help their startup succeed. And the fact that there are thousands of people who do that, and that community of grassroots energy continues to grow, that gives me some hope that we're on the right track. But yeah, this has not been studied in a rigorous way, and if anybody's listening who has the capability to do that study, I would sure like to see the results.
Okay, there's a challenge out to Ontario's academics to do a world's first and figure this stuff out. We will be going to questions from the microphones. I see we've got a few lines. We can't guarantee we'll get to everybody, but we will go to each of the microphones. Eric, I'm going to ask you to try and keep your answers short so that we can nail this and get through as many as possible. But first, I got a question for you.
For my answer so far, it's not exactly my forte.
We're doing great. So you did an Ask Me Anything on Reddit recently, and someone asked you what you thought the outlook was for the tech industry and whether there would be a shakeup. And your answer was rather enigmatic. You said, yes, but winter is coming. Now, if you'd been in Toronto for the past 6 months, you'd know why that's particularly scary to us. But what did you mean by that?
Sure. Winter is coming is a phrase, of course, from the great show and series of books, Game of Thrones. And it's actually a perfect metaphor for those that know the work, of course, find it funny, but I actually think there's a real wisdom to it. This is a series of fantasy novels, and one of the kind of core motifs of this fantasy world is that there are years of summer followed by years of winter. And that's a recurring phenomenon. But because summer lasts for years, not months, I know maybe in Ontario it may feel like winter lasts for years, but I'm told that even in Ontario it does not. In this world it does, and so they have this phenomenon that they are always fighting with, which is that because summer can go on for an indeterminate number of years, there are people they call summer's children, people who were born in summer and have never seen winter. And so to them, winter is like a fairy tale that people talk about, but they have a hard time convincing the younger generation to prepare for the eventuality of winter, which is an inevitable occurrence. And if that doesn't sound familiar to any of you who are spending time in the entrepreneurial ecosystem right now, then I don't know what you're up to, because that to me seems like a spot-on issue that we are dealing with right now. We have had an incredible wave of explosive growth, and we've had a huge number of investors and entrepreneurs who have never seen a crash, who have never seen a correction, who believe this will go on forever. And there's one thing that we all know for sure is that can't possibly be true.
Well, we know there were 7 years of plenty and 7 years of lean, biblically, so I guess you're covered.
Yeah, exactly. But I'll give one countervailing point to this is Mark Andreessen's point, which is people have been saying that it's a bubble and this year is the top of the bubble every year for like 7 years straight. So if you invest on the basis of that pessimism, you would lose out on a lot of growth. And someone just did a recent chart. If you had invested a certain amount of money at the very top of the NASDAQ bubble in 2001, how would you be doing today? And you'd be doing pretty incredible, even if you survived the crash. Yes, you had some bad years, but it has come roaring back. So yeah, I don't know what this means from an investment strategy point of view, but I do know what it means for entrepreneurs, which is be ready.
And how would an entrepreneur prepare themselves for a freeze like this, a shakeout like you're describing?
Well, this is the great thing. The operational advice in good times and bad times is the same. Use your money wisely, be efficient, and make sure that every ounce of energy you expend is on serving customers. Now, that's easier to do in the lean times because there's no alternative. In the good times, what happens is people get distracted by the possibility of building a company to flip, building a company that's designed to be sexy to investors so that they can raise more money. I mean, we see an epidemic of this happening in Silicon Valley. And so, to me, the number one piece of advice for entrepreneurs is just don't get distracted, build value for customers, and the rest will follow.
Okay, great. We're going to the microphones now. Somewhere out here is...
Definition. What is a pivot? A pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. So to have accountability for a pivot, you have to show evidence that the new direction is taking you closer to that vision. The new strategy is superior to the old one. So one way to think about a pivot is as a new strategic hypothesis that new experimentation will test. And as long as you maintain that requirement, that you have to kind of prove that the pivot was a good one, then you can have a framework of strong accountability.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're going to go to the microphone.
On the School of Engineering, and my question is about teams. So in the startup community, we have a lot of these great processes, the lean startup, custom development. But one of the things we hear from investors is that they invest in teams. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on do you think that there's a lack of emphasis on teams in the community and on personalities or people?
Sorry, can you just repeat the last bit?
Yeah.
Are you okay, Eric? Okay, take it away.
What you're seeing is just an innate difference between how entrepreneurs and investors see the world, and it's never going to go away. And it's actually a big mistake. Entrepreneurs, I think, are very eager to show their methodology and process to their investors to demonstrate their competence. And the truth is, investors don't care. They just don't care. Investors care about results and the things that they think predict results. So the reason investors always say we invest in teams is that's ultimately from them, in their experience, the heuristic that they have seen over and over again is that when they see a great team, they know great results follow. And here's a question that investors don't like to talk about too much, which is, well, what makes a team great? And the investors are like, well, you just know it when you see it. You know, if you've got the right stuff, you're a great team. Now, for entrepreneurs, they hate to hear that. It's like, well, if I don't have the right stuff, what do I do? And from an investor's point of view, it's like, I don't care. If you don't have the right stuff, get out of my office. Wait, you're clogging up the hallway for someone who has the right stuff. But the truth is, having the right stuff is not an innate or genetic thing. Teams that work on improving their skills over time can become magically the right stuff. And that's where the process and all the kind of mechanics of customer development and lean startup all come in, is that if you are willing to be rigorous in your thinking and relentlessly pursue the kind of results that we advocate, you know, where you're really learning about customers what they want, you will be perceived by your investors as superhuman. And I actually did this by accident. One of the things that happened to me when I was doing my last startup was I got a reputation in Silicon Valley for having superpowers. People thought I had some kind of magical ability to make my engineers more productive than other people. And I would go around saying, listen, it's not me, it's the system, it's the process. We have this superior, and nobody wanted to hear it. Because they're like, yeah, but sure, Superman, it's like Superman's talking to you about the mechanics of flying. It's like, I don't care, you're Superman, I want to invest in your company. And I was like, yeah, listen, more companies could operate this way. And it was like a major clash of worldviews that I experienced in Silicon Valley. Now, I remain convinced that although I appreciate the compliment, I do think I have certain talents, I do not believe I'm a superhero. I don't think I have that. That's not magic dust that I can sprinkle on a team. It really is a rigorous methodology. But the good news is, you apply the methodology well, you will appear to have superpowers to investors.
Fantastic. Very encouraging. Thanks, Eric.